Our four panelists, Sujit Sivasundaram first came to Caius in 2001 as a research fellow. He has since had 2 stints as a college lecturer and is now also professor of world history in the university. His book, Waves Across the South, A New History of Revolution and Empire, was published by William Collins in August. Michael Taylor first came to Caius as a fresher in 2007. Seems like only yesterday, Michael. And happily for us, stayed on for an MPhil and a PhD. Since finishing the PhD, he's been a lecturer in British history at Oxford, and most recently a visiting fellow at the British Library's Eccles Center for American Studies. His book, The Interest, How the British Establishment Resisted the Abolition of Slavery, was published just a few days ago by Bodley Head. Bronwen Everill came to Caius in 2015 as a 1973 college lecturer and director of studies in history. Her work, like Sujit, spans a number of often discrete historical worlds, the Americas, Europe, and Africa, in her case. Her book, Not Made by Slaves, Ethical Capitalism in the Age of Abolition, was published by Harvard University Press in September. And finally, Jake Subryan Richards, who will lead the discussion, came to Caius as a fresher in 2010, and again, happily for us, returned to do his PhD here on liberated Africans and law in the South Atlantic, 1839 to 1871, completed just earlier this year. And we look forward to celebrating it in due course when it is refined, as I'm sure it will be into book form. He is assistant professor of African history at the LSE. So that's the order of play, and I'll pass over to Sujit to kick us off.
Thank you very much, Peter, for setting this up, and also to Jake for chairing. And it's an absolute pleasure, really, to join Michael Taylor and Bronwen Everill in this conversation. So the first thing to say about the book, Waves Across the South, which I'm down to introduce this evening, is that it's not principally about the history of enslavement. So the main concerns of the book fall under the 2 other terms which appear in the title of this roundtable. Firstly, the Age of Revolutions, and secondly, empire. In this sense, it's a history of the same period as that covered by Bronwen and Michael, and it's also about diversifying the vantage points from which history is researched, taught, remembered, debated, but it's trying to bring into view a group of subordinated peoples who are not marked primarily by their enslavement, but by their positionality as indigenous. And these indigenous peoples are those ocean-going and ocean-facing peoples across the global South in the Indian and Pacific Oceans, who feature in this book. So every good Caius historian will probably have no problem in reciting the standard narrative of the Age of Revolutions. It's evident, it was evident, of course, in the work of R.R. Palmer famously, and Eric Hobsbawm also played a pivotal role in this narrative. And the narrative goes something like this. There's the American Revolution, there's a French Revolution, there's a Haitian Revolution, there are independence movements in Latin America, and then there's the Industrial Revolution as well. And all of these together, they generate notions of rights, of belonging, perhaps a nation state itself, certainly the application of reform, reason, science, militarism, and knowledge. And all of these products then diffuse in this narrative to the wider world, and they diffuse certainly to the East. And there was this thesis about a swing to the East, which was a phrase used by historians about 20 years ago now. So what I'm trying to do in this book is to turn this narrative on its head by taking it to the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean. And I'm also trying to turn the story around a bit by attending to how a new maritime empire came to life by following a surge of indigenous politics in the global South. And I name this, of course, the British Empire, as a counter-revolution. So to simplify matters a little bit, perhaps, and I'm going to show you my first slide now. Can I do this? So to simplify matters, I use the object of the wave to summarize the argument. And here's an image of a wave breaking on the coast of Chennai in Madras. And you really get a sense of the material and environmental context for the book and the period from this image. Because moving from sea to land is dangerous. Things can go wrong. Ships can be wrecked. Ships can be tossed into the air. People can be washed aboard. And there's a lot of heavy work that's required as you move from sea to land, and that work is often undertaken by people of color, as is evident in this image. So using this idea of the wave was a way of summarizing the argument for me and getting to the unevenness and unpredictability and violence that characterized the age of revolutions. So just as we look at this image, let me try and summarize the argument briefly and simply. There is an indigenous wave of creativity, unrest, revolt, and association in the Indian and Pacific Ocean. And then there's another wave, which I've sometimes described as a tsunami, which is the imperial wave of counter-revolt. Both these waves, like waves, don't reach completion, full completion, but it's in the intersection of these two things, these two waves, that we see the transformative legacies of this period for the 19th century. So having done an overview from above, what I want to do very quickly then is to do a deep dive. And there are a lot of places covered in the book, and I don't have time to go into all of the places in the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean covered in the book. It ranges from 1790 to 1850. But because of the focus of Michael's work and Bronwen's work, what I thought was that I'd simply focus in on one place, and that place is Mauritius. And in quickly outlining its history, just to illustrate how revolution and empire form waves of unrest and intervention, and how debates about slavery are a very useful way of tracking this. So as I say, the book isn't primarily about the history of enslavement. Now there's a quick timeline because historians like dates and timelines, so I'll say something about that in a minute. I'm not going to go through all of the detail of this, you'll be happy to know, but it's just there for you to refer to so that you get your dates right, because people debate dates quite a lot and sometimes get the dates wrong for the history of enslavement and abolition, especially in this part of the world, perhaps. So of course, Mauritius is French. By the end of the 18th century, it's the headquarters of the French Indian Ocean world, and it draws to itself people from across the Indian Ocean. It's originally uninhabited, but it's by this time inhabited by a diverse range of people, including enslaved peoples. And one key moment is that moment in 1790, when we see the arrival of the news of the French Revolution, and that's one wave of revolution in Mauritius itself, because immediately you have the revolutionary cockade worn, assemblies set up, the governor's power hemmed in. But of course, this excludes free people of color from membership, and this despite their demand to, in their words, exercise a right which they believed to be founded in nature and the law. News then arrives of the abolition of slavery, and in fact, Mauritius seeks to resist the abolition of slavery. An embassy of a lawyer and a former journalist have to flee for their lives. So the point here is that this is a heavily localized age of revolutions, and in many ways, an attempt for Mauritius to exert its independence over France. But this is also an Indian Ocean story of colonial and non-colonial connections across the global south. And one thing that really sort of I was interested in to explore was the arrival in Mauritius of an embassy from Tipu Sultan of Mysore in South India. He sends off an embassy. He's vilified, of course, by the British as an archetypical Oriental despot, but he tries to draw on the power of Mauritius for his own politics, which has sometimes been classed as Republican in turn in India. So Mauritius becomes really a beacon for Indian Ocean revolutionary culture. There are embassies, there's an embassy here from Burma, Myanmar as well, and also from the Patriots on the Cape frontier. But then Mauritius is annexed by the British in 1810, partly because it's a beacon of republicanism and because it's connected in British propaganda with piracy. And here then is counter-revolution, the wave of counter-revolution. Moving forward with this rhythm of types of revolution and imperialism, the story doesn't end, certainly in 1810. Indeed, illegal slavery carries on in the early years of British rule of Mauritius, despite the governance of a supposedly abolitionist governor. Mauritius then becomes one of the first places where the British take the new coerced laborers of the 19th century, the South Asian indentured workers, who fill the gap of work left by enslaved peoples. Meanwhile, the very language of emancipation, what it means to be emancipated, is utilized for political purposes really into the 19th century. It's a debate, the debate about enslavement is still alive and kicking, even into the 1840s, because the argument runs, well, if, and this is the argument in the period's terms, if the slaves have been emancipated, then the colony needs to be emancipated. And this is the language really that one sees around 1848, which is a moment which is coincident with the global moment of 1848, certainly in Europe, where a revolutionary spirit runs across Europe. So now, coming up from this deep dive, let me make some closing points about what this history means for today. It was a really, really moving moment for me personally, and I'm doing this partly because I can show you an image of the Bateman Auditorium where perhaps we might have met for this event as well. But the moving moment here was to host Vijay Lakshmi Tilak, scholar of labor from the University of Mauritius, to give a lecture on the legacies of indenture. There was a good but not large audience, but certainly a significant number of people of Mauritian heritage in the UK who attended this lecture. And the general message I heard from the audience was, well, that their history is not known in Britain, that there's a scholarly neglect of Mauritius, but also a public neglect of the history of Mauritius. And that's certainly true of many places across the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean, which have been marginalized in public debate and historiography as well. A few days ago, a friend from Mauritius sent me these photographs of the opening of Mauritius's new Intercontinental Slavery Museum on the site of a military hospital built by enslaved persons. It arises out of the long delayed and resisted recommendations of Mauritius's Truth and Justice Commission. It's right next to the so-called Aparavasi Ghat, which commemorates the site where coerced indentured laborers were landed by the British. So though the history of the Global South can be easily forgotten in the UK, it's undeniable that debates about empire are still at the forefront of public discussion in each of these sites in the Global South. This is a history that's remembered in the South, if it's not remembered in Britain. And it certainly matters to diasporic communities from formerly colonized territories now in the UK. So what we need then is for British audiences and institutions to take account of this, certainly, to stop marginalizing this history and to engage with communities and scholars and universities in the territories that were taken by the British in what I call a counter-revolt. So it's not a recitation of facts and numbers, though I think that's significant too. History is something that, where the richness of the discipline depends on the perspectives that we bring. And so opening it up to many communities and to the young is a way of making sure that it keeps alive going forward. And so more broadly, I guess, the project of this book is to open up new perspectives. And I guess that sort of thing has to keep happening over and over again. So I've always voted for a focus on Atlantic enslavement, but I'm not a historian of the Atlantic. So the way I see it is that there are many perspectives from which the history of the Age of Revolutions and Empire should be told, and that the perspectives of an Aboriginal Australian or a Khoisan person or a Javanese fighter deserve their role as well in this narrative of this key period of the Age of Revolutions. In this sense, certainly we need to engage with the history of enslavement. And then beyond that, there are other histories too that need to be brought into this conversation about the legacies of this period beyond the Atlantic. So I'll just leave it there and hand over to Bronwen.
No, Michael.
Okay, thanks, Sujit. Are you still sharing your screen? Yeah. Hello, and thank you everybody for attending. So my book, The Interest, had its genesis in the PhD that I began at Caius in 2011 and finished in 2015. And the basic premises of the book is that if the abolition of slavery in the British Empire was a great achievement, then there must logically and inevitably have been great obstacles in its way. And there hasn't been that much scholarship on this. I mean, it's grown enormously in the last 5 or 6 years. But really, British history and public memory has tended to remember abolition, but not the slavery and the trading in slaves that had to go on beforehand. So it's perhaps worth beginning in 1807 when, as everybody used to know, Wilberforce and the Saints abolished the slave trade, or Parliament abolished the slave trade. It's worth pointing out that abolishing the slave trade did absolutely nothing to affect slavery itself. So New Year's Day 1808, when the last slave ship docked, there were still 700,000 people in bondage across the British West Indies and in South America. Colonial slavery still existed. The abolitionists at the time hadn't even tried to abolish slavery. It wasn't part of their political plans. In fact, over the next 10 years, the British slave empire continues to grow because at the end of the Napoleonic Wars, they seized both Trinidad and Demerara, what's now Guyana. In fact, it's not even until 1823 that the first anti-slavery society is founded, and it's founded in a pub that's now demolished called the King's Head on a very small street in London called Poultry, which is beside Bank. And even then, it takes another 10 years for the anti-slavery society to succeed. And that 10-year period of controversy between abolitionists and an enormously powerful pro-slavery lobby that I called the interest, because the West India interest was the colloquialism for it at the time, is the subject of the book. I feel slightly geographically constrained because Sujit is stretching these stories about slavery and empire over a quarter of the globe, and Bronwen is taking the traditional economic map of the Atlantic and putting West Africa right at the heart of that. It could be argued that I'm really pushing all of these stories into a couple of square miles in central London because for the first time, I think, I'm trying to tell the stories of slavery and abolition in Britain as something that's infiltrated into every corner of politics, into every corner of the public sphere, press. And that's a story, and that's certainly a narrative that hasn't really been discussed at length. The narrative is arguably quite simple, that whenever the Anti-Slavery Society began its campaign in 1823, there was a staunchly conservative consensus and a coalition in government led by Lord Liverpool, but practically led by George Canning. And that while they promised and encouraged measures of amelioration, which is to say improving the condition of enslaved people in the West Indies, they planned to do absolutely nothing. In fact, they allowed the West India interest themselves to write the measures that would be proposed to the West Indies, which is just the archetypal form of regulatory capture. So nothing really happens for a long time. Lord Liverpool has a stroke and dies in 1827, and then the Tories have a year of complete disorder. Then Wellington takes over, and nothing is definitely happening under Wellington, who's arguably the most pro-slavery politician in British history. So what's happening to the abolitionists at this time? Well, this is quite nicely whenever how Sujit's book and mine interlock, because they get interested in Mauritius. A man called Edward Byam, who used to be a colonial governor, colonial official in Mauritius, comes back to Britain, starts exposing the truth about Mauritian slavery, because for a very long time, people in Britain assumed that nobody was trading in slaves in Mauritius and therefore didn't really bother looking for any kind of infraction of the imperial law. And it's this interest in Mauritius that serves as a lightning rod for anti-slavery dissent in the late 1820s and somehow keeps the movement alive. Context then resurrects the anti-slavery movement in 1830 because the previous year, in order to stave off a potential civil war in Ireland, the Tories force Catholic emancipation through the House of Commons and through Parliament. A bunch of Tories break off, form the ultra-Tory group in opposition, and the government eventually falls. This lets in the Whigs. The Whigs spend 2 years preoccupied with the reform of Parliament, not the colonies, but finally, whenever a reformed Parliament is returned in 1833, the abolitionists seize their moment. What happens then really calls into question whether or not emancipation of colonial slaves was a victory for justice or for morality, because the only way that emancipation is secured is first by promising a payout to the slaveholders of £20 million in 1833. This at the time was about 40% of the government's annual budget. And of course, there was a smaller state back then and there's inflation, but if you work out what that is as a proportion of the last fiscal year, it's £340 billion. It was certainly the largest single payout in British financial history until the bank bailout of 2008. At the same time, the slaveholders are given another cushion, which is that the enslaved peoples of the Caribbean will be forced to endure what's thought to be at first 6 years of apprenticeship. An apprenticeship is indentured labor, but effectively slavery by another name, but they're forced to work for free in the same jobs, in the same plantations, working for the same planters. And if they do any other work on the side, they can earn some money and perhaps buy their freedom early. So this is the story of slavery and emancipation as I hope it actually was in Britain. You know, we had 10 years of really ferocious fighting. We had most of the Conservative MPs, most of the political grandees at the time, the City of London and all the financial institutions, many of the most prominent publishers of the day, John Murray, William Blackwood, The Times, The Spectator. There was this enormous array of incredibly influential people in Britain who were arrayed on the side of the slaveholders, and they were there for the most part in a majority until 1833. It's only after emancipation that abolitionism and anti-slavery, in my opinion, become defining British values. There's a sudden volte-face where people who had been aggressively pro-slavery until 1833 perform a whitewash, and I use that word advisedly because these are some of the most aggressively racist and hideous people, racist even by the standards of their own time. And yet they, like everybody else, suddenly begins to celebrate in a national story, the national triumph of abolition. Sadly, that really just doesn't cut it. And it's formed part of our national mythology. So I hope that by interrogating that national myth and by telling the story as it actually happened, I might contribute something to our ongoing debates about Britain's real role in enslavement and imperialism in the wider world. And on that, I will hand over to Bronwen.
Thanks very much. And thanks to Peter and the Development Office for organizing, and for everybody else for welcoming me on board with the seminar. So I'm going to start with two questions, which may sound strange, but hopefully they'll make some more sense by the end. Why do we have fair trade bananas and not fair trade cars? Or why does a label that says made in Britain or made in America mean something totally different to one that says made in Bangladesh? You'll be surprised to learn from a historian that the answers to these questions can be found in the 19th century. At the end of the 18th century, as Sujit alluded to, the sort of peak of the Age of Revolutions, a century in which the consumer revolution had dramatically reshaped people's ideas about their relationship to the economy and the economy's relationship to politics. Abolitionists saw the connections between their consumption of things like sugar and cotton and rum and the enslavement of the people who produced those goods. In response to seeing those threads of responsibility, some abstained, what we would call boycotting. Others, though, looked for more ethical sources of those goods. If consumers were responsible for shaping demand and for shaping the global supply chain in which slavery was implicated, then they had a responsibility to use their power as consumers to ensure that those global supply chains were ethical. But what they discovered in sort of implementing this logic was that supply chains weren't as simple. The sort of development of an ethical supply chain wasn't as simple as just avoiding the slave trade. It gave rise to a whole range of questions about developing new ideas of ethical trade in this period. So like, what about the morality of other goods? How could consumers assess things that weren't produced by enslaved labor, but enabled the slave trade in other ways? Or what about the business practices of the companies who sourced and sold supposedly ethical goods? Did they need to be ethical as well? And how could consumers ensure that those supposedly ethical goods were really made without enslaved labor anyway? In Not Made by Slaves, I explored these questions and their implications for the development of liberal political economy in the 19th century and the expansion of imperialism across the century. The book connects up two different strands of abolitionist business that sort of make the supply chain whole. One concerned with legitimate commerce on the supply side, and the other concerned with free produce on the demand side. So legitimate commerce was a project aimed at West Africa, where merchants sought to replace the slave trade out of Africa with other types of trade in primary products like ivory or dyewoods, timber, and then ultimately sort of by the middle of the 19th century, palm oil and peanuts. Free produce was a demand-side solution in Britain, and especially in the US, that aimed to provide consumer goods like sugar and cotton textiles made without the use of enslaved labor, in order to create consumer demand that would incentivize free labor production of those goods. So that's the sort of supply chain element of the argument. One of the other main arguments of the book is for the importance of West Africa in these projects. So West Africa's consumer demand helps to highlight the importance of the consumer revolution around the Atlantic world in shaping these kinds of consumer-led abolition arguments. West African states also boycotted the Atlantic slave trade at the end of the 18th century, which I argue shows that many people around the Atlantic world saw the slave trade as both a moral and a commercial problem. And that's what gives rise to all of this theorizing about how to fix the problem of slavery from a commercial and economic perspective, rather than just a political and moral perspective. So obviously there are abolitionists who are, deeply invested in the political and moral side of things. But what I'm interested in is why then also this commercial side of things. Cross-cultural trade in West Africa also raises questions about the ethics of trade explicitly. So for instance, is it ethical to trade guns in order to undermine the slave trade? Many abolitionists argued that it was, because the guns that they were providing were supposed to be used, according to these abolitionists, to prevent people from being enslaved and captured. And the argument that they had was that if you didn't provide guns to people to avoid being enslaved and captured, then they would have to sell other people into the slave trade in order to access those guns from slave traders who were willing to sell the guns. But this argument changes over time as people become aware of the problems that are arising with the sale of guns and the sort of link to enslavement. West Africa is also important in shaping abolitionist arguments about both the incentives to slave trading, so what causes people to get involved in slave trading, and the effects of slave trading on the development of economies. And this sort of latter argument, the effects of slave trading, allows them to make claims about the supposed benefits of an enforced shift from the slave trade to legitimate commerce to the people of Africa. So they are able to say, well, the slave trade has so devastated the whole continent of Africa that any intervention that we make there will be an improvement for the people who live there. And therefore, we don't have to worry too much about the ethical knock-on effects of our interventions. Finally, experimentation in West African free labor agriculture, just like in Mauritius, a lot of this is free labor, exposes the potential and the limitations of imperial abolition schemes. So where the line is between abolitionists' rhetoric and what they have to put into place in practice in order to make their plans come to fruition. So for me, West Africa also gets us back to those initial questions that I raised at the beginning. Because although abolitionist businesses involved in trying to shape demand for ethical goods wanted to reshape production, their arguments relied on appealing to consumer self-interest to do it. And in order to do that, they had to make two arguments. The first was about the cheapness of free labor, and the second was about the benefits of free labor to basically anyone implicated in the global supply chain. So the cheapness of free labor first. This is something that abolitionist businesses get from Adam Smith. They believe that slave labor is apparently too expensive and that free labor would be much more efficient. And they need to prove this. They want to prove this to show that the market is rational and that the market will solve the problem of slavery. Ultimately, though, the way to prove that free labor was cheaper was to push for tariff-free trade in parts of the world where tropical goods could be produced without capital inputs by British firms, and where either commercial debt or coercion would ensure that British firms retain the ability to command prices for those tropical goods. Essentially, they end up exploiting different standards of living around the world. And they argue that this will benefit the laborers in those countries because they will be getting income from selling the goods that they are selling to these British traders, and therefore their standards of living will gradually improve. Plus, they will no longer be enslaved. So it's a sort of what they claim is a win-win. It'll be cheaper for consumers and it'll improve the lives of these people around the world. It's an argument that I call rising tide lifts all boats, but that's actually apparently attributed to John F. Kennedy in the 20th century, so it's a bit anachronistic. But basically they're arguing that there are benefits of free labor to the consumers who get cheap stuff and to the producers who make it because they will get paid something, that it's like a pretty low bar, but it's an improvement. And this argument enables abolitionists to embrace the spread of imperialism around the globe. So they look to India as a solution to the problem of free labor sugar, for instance. They look to Mauritius as a solution to the problem of free labor sugar. And they look to West Africa as a solution to both sugar and cotton and pretty much anything else that they try out there. In the US, which is a bit more wary of this British argument about the global division of labor, the appeal to self-interest becomes even more literal as they settle on white free labor as the ultimate ethical labor. American consumers can support white American producers and know that they are fighting slavery. And so while the enslaved producers were the imagined beneficiaries of ethical capitalism, my argument in the book is that the most persuasive and influential argument formulated by these ethical businesses were those that promoted the consumer's power, both to receive the benefits of global capitalism and to arbitrate its morality. By framing abolitionism as an appeal to people's self-interest as consumers, I argue that the abolitionist businesses that I write about substituted a moral collective action problem with an economic one. And this is a legacy that we see in the sort of movement for ethical capitalism that still very much dictates industrial, agricultural, trade, and climate policies, I think, today. Thanks very much.
Thank you to Sujit, Michael, and Bronwen for 3 wonderful presentations and for also publishing wonderful books, which I was lucky enough to read in draft. So it's wonderful to see the final products out there in the world. I think all 3 books here make really important interventions in helping us rethink both chronologies and geographies when it comes to slavery and empire. We might associate the Age of Revolutions with some of those historic dates like 1789 as a start and 1848 as an end, or histories of slavery revolving around the big legislative acts of abolition of the slave trade in 1807 or general emancipation in 1833. And in fact, all 3 of these books complicate those chronologies, extending further back in time, reorientating our perspectives on the importance of indigenous peoples to these histories earlier in the 18th century, emphasizing the importance of indentured labor and forms of apprenticeship beyond 1807 or beyond 1833 as vital to these stories as well, about the production of goods which global consumers relied upon. Also, all 3 of these books reshape our sense of geography in really important ways. As Sujit mentioned, the importance of indigenous peoples in Pacific Islands make us rethink questions about indigenous kingship, revolutionary forms of government and trade. Michael's book, which he said here unjustly is about London, really emphasizes the importance of revolt by enslaved peoples in Guyana, for example, in the 1820s, and the effect that that has on the interest in the late 1820s is absolutely vital to the story. So Michael's book bridges between London and Mauritius, as he mentioned, but also the West Indies and Guyana in South America too. And Bronwen's book very ambitiously brings West Africa into the Atlantic world and into these stories of ethical capitalism, bridging between British, French, and American archives and sources, as well as sources from archives in West Africa. So all 3 of these books are also helping us rethink, really importantly, how empires related to one another, the longer histories of slavery and indenture, and how that crosses between oceans and lands, islands and coasts throughout global history. So I would like to thank our 3 panelists for taking time to share their books with us today. A reminder that Sujit's Waves Across the South, Michael's The Interest, and Bronwen's Not Made by Slaves are available from all good booksellers, digital and physical, after lockdown. And thank you so much for everyone for coming. I've seen that in the chat, people are saying they're buying, they're going out to buy the books and requests to make these events more regular. So, there's a lot of enthusiasm for Caius history out there, which is wonderful. This event will be available on the college website and on YouTube soon afterwards. I'd like to thank everyone for attending and see you all again soon, hopefully. Thank you very much.